Shia LaBeouf, a very pitiful narcissist. This video dissects for you an article that was recently in the New York Times, written by Katie Benner and Melina Reisig, that was published on the 11th of December and was updated on the 13th of December, appertaining to a lawsuit that has been filed by somebody called FKA Twigs, not a name that I confess to be familiar with, who has sued Shia LaBeouf, a name that I am familiar with, citing relentless abusive relationship. I'm going to go through the article for you, providing you with analysis and observation from the perspective of the issue of narcissism. The article begins thus. Just after Valentine's Day in 2009, the musician FKA Twigs was in a car speeding towards Los Angeles. At the wheel was her boyfriend, the actor Shia LaBeouf. He was driving recklessly, she said, in a lawsuit filed on Friday, removing his seatbelt and threatening to crash unless she professed her love for him. Now, of course, on the basis of the article, we have to take it at face value that the material stated in it is true, and that is the evidence that's placed before us. And this isn't about the determination as to whether the events actually occurred, but on the basis that if they did, the appropriate analysis that is applied to them. And therefore, with regard to this allegation that Shia LaBeouf was driving recklessly, that shows lack of accountability. Removing his seatbelt demonstrates lack of accountability. Threatening to crash is the application of control through the issuing of threat, and the condition there was that he would crash unless she professed her love for him. Her declaring her love for him would of course be the provision of fuel by the potent intimate partner primary source, as she then was, and allow LaBeouf to recognise that he had control over her. The article continues. They were returning from the desert where Mr. LaBeouf, the star of Transformers, had raged at her throughout the trip. Rage is the manifestation of ignited fury in a heated manner as a consequence of a response to wounding, and is done to assert control, to provoke, and to draw fuel. FKA Twigs explained that in the lawsuit he once woke her in the middle of the night, choking her. Physical violence, boundary transgression, lack of emotional empathy. After she begged to be let out of the car, she said he pulled over at a gas station and she took her bags from the trunk. But Mr. LaBeouf followed assertion of control, sense of entitlement, and assaulted her, physical manipulation, by way of the assertion of control, throwing her against the car while screaming in her face, insult, provocation, manifestation of heated fury, according to the lawsuit. He then forced her back into the car, assertion of control, intimidation, bullying. The gas station incident is at the heart of the lawsuit that says Mr. LaBeouf, age 34, abused FKA Twigs physically, emotionally, and mentally, many times in a relationship that lasted just short of a year. Evidently that the golden period was well and truly over, and she was being subjected to a sustained devaluation. Her aim in coming forward, she said in an interview, was to explain how even a critically acclaimed artist with money, a home and a strong network of supporters could be caught in such a cycle. Indeed, all individuals are at risk of being abused. I'd like to be able to raise awareness on the tactics that abusers use to control you and take away your agency, FKA Twigs 32, born Talia Debrett Barnett, said. Mr. LaBeouf responded Thursday to the concerns raised by Ms. Barnett and a second former girlfriend who had accused him of abusive behaviour. Note that as a pattern developed here, in an email that broadly addressed his conduct. I'm not in a position to tell anyone how my behaviour made them feel. Facade management. Apparent compassion. Loftiness, he said in an email to the New York Times. I have no excuses for my alcoholism. Actually, You're using your alcoholism as an excuse for your abusive behaviour, blame shifting, or aggression, only rationalizations. Of course, the rationalizations are the excuse for his behaviour, and this is deflection and blame shifting. I have a history of hurting the people closest to me. Admission, but a false one, wrapped up in a pity play. I'm ashamed of that history. He isn't. This is false contrition, and I'm sorry to those I hurt. False contrition. If he had any emotional empathy, why did he keep doing it? There is nothing else I can really say. Dismissiveness, lack of accountability. The lawsuit, filed in Los Angeles Superior Court, says that Mr. LaBeouf knowingly gave Miss Barnett a sexually transmitted disease. If this is true, sense of entitlement, lack of emotional empathy, lack of accountability. It accuses him of relentless abuse, pattern of sustained devaluation, including sexual battery, assault, and infliction of emotional distress, all forms of manipulative assertion of control. Mr. LaBeouf and his representative did not immediately respond to a request for comment on the lawsuit. Carolyn Foe, a stylist who is another of Mr. LaBeouf's former girlfriends, described similarly tumultuous experiences to the New York Times, some of which are also outlined in the lawsuit. Once, the suit says, he drunkenly pinned her to a bed and headbutted her. Assertion of control, physical violence, lack of emotional empathy, doing so enough that she bled. Afterwards, she began to grapple with the idea that he was abusing her. Note, emotional thinking causing her to doubt what was actually occurring. So much goes into breaking down a man or woman to make them okay with a certain kind of treatment, she said in an interview. Again, this is the effect of the emotional thinking causing the individual to not realise precisely what is going on and to continue to accept what is clearly abusive behaviour towards them. Presented with a detailed account of the claims that the women made against him in interviews and subsequently in the lawsuit, Mr. LaBeouf, responding in a separate email, wrote that many of these allegations are not true, denial, but he continued he owed the women the opportunity to air their statements publicly and accept accountability for those things that I have done. Notice that if he says that many of the allegations are not true, then the following statement is an empty one. Basically, he's saying, you can say what you like, but it doesn't impact upon me, the rejection of the threat to the assertion of his control. He added that he was a sober member of a 12-step program and in therapy. I am not cured of my PTSD and alcoholism. Blame shifting, utilization of ill health and other conditions for the purposes of escaping blame and lack of accountability. But I am committed to doing what I need to do to recover, and I will forever be sorry to the people that I may have harmed along the way. Note, I may have harmed, not I have harmed, or I certainly have harmed. Again, lack of accountability, promised change, false contrition. Mr. LaBeouf has a long history of turbulent behaviour, i.e. demonstrating a haphazard response by way of collateral consequence whenever he has a challenge to his control, which he then needs to assert. So his narcissism causes him to behave in a particular way, gains control, but there are considerable fallouts, namely this turbulent behaviour. He's been arrested several times on charges that have been dismissed, including assault and disorderly conduct, according to newspaper reports and public records. The fact that he had to be arrested demonstrates that there was a problem to begin with. It's not detailed why the charges have been dismissed. It might be as a consequence of a lack of evidence, as opposed to it necessarily because the complainant withdraws, common with certain victims, rather than it being that there's no actual substance in the allegation. In 2015, strangers record the video of him arguing with his girlfriend at the time, the actress Mia Goth, telling her, "This is the kind of thing that makes a person abusive, argumentative, blame-shifting, projection." After the men recording Mr. LaBeouf gave him a ride, he told them, "If I'd have stayed there, I would have killed her," according to the video. Grandiosity. Ms. Barnett said Mr. LaBeouf would squeeze or grab her to the point of bruising. Physical assault, assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy. But she didn't go to the police, she said, first out of misguided concern about harming his career, emotional thinking corrupting her empathic trait of decency, and later because she thought her account would not be taken seriously and it would be futile. Though many states have laws that treat gender-based sexual or domestic violence as a civil rights violation, tort suits of the kind Miss Barnett is pursuing with a daunting account of painful moments are relatively uncommon, continues the article. Most often, allegations arise amid divorce or custody proceedings, or while seeking orders of protection. But there has been a slight uptick in civil claims since the #MeToo movement, amid more attention on the complex nature of abuse, said Julie Goldscheid, a law professor at CUNY Law School, who studies gender violence and civil rights. 3 women die each day at the hands of their abusers, according to the National Organization for Women. The pandemic has exacerbated dangerous situations by forcing partners to stay without interruption in close quarters, law enforcement officials said, and hotlines around the world have reported increasing calls for help. As I've detailed in separate material, the Narcissist and COVID-19, the impact of the pandemic has meant that people have been forced to stay with abusers, and who are narcissists, of course, and that has resulted in repeated threats to the control manifesting, and therefore the manifestation of abuse, be it sexual, physical, economic, or emotional, has increased. In the lawsuit, Ms. Barnett describes how she met Mr. LaBeouf in 2018, when she was cast in Honey Boy, a mostly autobiographical film he wrote, and they started dating after the movie wrapped. The early days of their relationship were marked by his over-the-top displays of affection, she says in the lawsuit, which helped earn her trust. You will all recognise this as love bombing, the flattery, the compliments, the bribery through gift buying. Notice how it's described as over-the-top displays of affection, and nobody's describing what it actually is. The article continues. In an abusive relationship, there's often a honeymoon phase, the golden or bronze period, as you all know it, as some experts call it, that builds intimacy and sets a benchmark for how happy the romance could be. It serves a powerful lure. Indeed, it does. It's how we seduce you, how we assert control over you. And although flashes of bliss may remain, respite periods, they are meted out through increasingly controlling demands and impossible standards of behaviour. Indeed, the sustained devaluation of the intimate partner primary source, when your fuel becomes stale, when your fuel isn't provided in large enough amounts, or infrequently enough. Notice again that there is the reference to the over-the-top displays of affection and this honeymoon phase, basically identifying love bombing, the golden period, possibly the bronze period, identifying controlling behaviour, but failing to recognise that it is being driven by narcissism. In the lawsuit, Miss Barnett and Miss Foe said that Mr. LaBeouf did not like it if they spoke to or looked at male waiters. In an interview, Miss Barnett said she learned to keep her eyes down when men spoke to her. The interaction between Miss Barnett and, for instance, a male waiter, either looking at that person or speaking to them, ditto for Miss Foe, wounds Mr. LaBeouf. It threatens his sense of control, and therefore he doesn't like it. He won't understand necessarily why, but his response is as a consequence of the threat to control manifested by the simple fact of both ladies engaging with another individual. The article continues. She also stated in the suit that Mr. LaBeouf had rules about how many times a day she had to kiss and touch him, assertion of control, gathering of fuel, which he enforced with constant haranguing and criticism. I suspect they mean repeated haranguing and criticism. And those are malign, devaluing behaviours utilised for the purposes of asserting control and the gathering of fuel. Mr. LaBeouf convinced Ms. Barnett to stay with him in Los Angeles, she said, rather than move back to London, where she and her professional circle lived. And this is the removal of support systems, the isolation of an individual from supporting individuals, which the narcissist instinctively identifies as threatening the ability to control the relevant primary source or relevant secondary source. It was a step towards her isolation, she said, and he would often say that her creative team used her. Triangulation, a message that eventually led her to doubt them. Assertion of control and the undermining of the reality of the individual by the repeated application of the triangulated behaviour. But living with him became frightening, she said. The lawsuit says that he kept a loaded firearm by the bed, sense of entitlement, lack of emotional empathy, and that she was scared to use the bathroom at night lest he mistake her for an intruder and shoot her. Shades of Oscar Pistorius, another narcissist. He didn't let her wear clothing to bed, control through clothing, and would spin a trifling disagreement, mountain out of a molehill, over an artist she liked and he didn't, for example, into an all-night fight. Assertion of control, argumentativeness, circular conversation, depriving her of sleep deprivation being a relatively common manner by which the narcissist operates. The situation came just as she was completing what became her most critically lauded album, Magdalene. Miss Barnett said she found herself in stasis, struggling to fulfil her professional duties and confounding her friends and colleagues. Of course, the fact that as she was completing her album, this would take attention away from LaBeouf, threaten his control, wound him. Twigs is always the driving force behind her career, always a step ahead of everyone else, said her longtime manager, Michael Sturton. This was an extreme change in her personality and character. The album's release was delayed multiple times and a tour was rescheduled at great cost. Mr. Sturton said, collateral consequences of the impact upon the victim's life as a consequence of the narcissist's behaviour towards her. Mr. Sturton added that as Miss Barnett receded, I could speak to her, he said, but I couldn't reach her. In effect, he was unable to get through to her as a combination of the hold that LaBeouf had over her, no doubt aided and abetted by her own emotional thinking. As Miss Barnett grew more isolated, isolation being a common behaviour and manipulation utilised by the narcissist to assert control, she said she felt as though her safety nets were unravelling. The gas station incident had happened in public, she said, and no one stepped to her aid. Obvious behaviours with regard to the assertion of control, lack of facade management in that incident. An early attempt she made to tell a colleague was brushed off. I just thought to myself, no one is ever going to believe me. Common response as a consequence of emotional thinking and a lack of understanding about what she's truly engaging with. She said in an interview, I'm unconventional and I'm a person of colour who is a female. Slowly, with the help of a therapist, she began to strategise her exit. While she was packing to leave in spring 2019, Mr. LaBeouf turned up unannounced, sense of entitlement, lack of boundary recognition, and terrorised her, according to a sworn statement from a witness, her housekeeper, in the lawsuit. When Miss Barnett wouldn't leave with him, threatening his control, the statement says he violently grabbed her, physical manipulation, picked her up and locked her in another room where he yelled at her. False imprisonment, heated fury through physical manhandling, and verbal tirade. Escaping him began to seem both difficult and dangerous, the lawsuit says, and even as she grew in resolve, she felt overwhelmed. She told her therapist in an email the Times has reviewed. Though she had the means, it took several attempts for Miss Barnett to extricate herself, not uncommon as a consequence of the factors of the narcissist issuing preventative hoovers, sensing that the individual is escaping the narcissist's grasp, and the presence of emotional thinking, causing people to believe that they can't escape, i.e., impose no contact. It was only afterwards that she realised how broken down she'd become. The whole time I was with him, I could have bought myself a business flight plane ticket back to my 4-storey townhouse in Hackney, in London, she said, and yet she didn't. He brought me so low below myself that the idea of leaving him and having to work myself back up just seemed impossible, she said. The erosion of self caused by the repeated application of the abuse, thus keeping the victim in place and easier to control. In her lawsuit, Ms. Barnett said she plans to donate a significant portion of any monetary damages to domestic violence charities. It was actually very expensive and a massive undertaking of time and resources to get out, she said in an interview. Her status makes her situation unusual, she said, but she wanted to share her story because it was otherwise so common. What I went through with Shia was the worst thing I've ever been through in the whole of my life, she said. I don't think people would ever think that it would happen to me, but I think that's the thing. It can happen to anybody. And indeed, it invariably does and can. And that is the breakdown of what has happened, and if all of the information provided by Ms. Barnett and the other witnesses is correct, this evidences that Shia LaBeouf is very much a pitiful narcissist. Of course, one other factor remains very important that arises out of this analysis. Once again, the word narcissism or narcissist was not mentioned once in the article. And whilst it's identified that LaBeouf has behaved in an abusive way and is labelled as an abuser, it is interesting, notwithstanding the fact that Ms. Barnett had the services of a therapist, that there is an absence both in terms of her understanding, the understanding of those who are helping her, and of the two relevant journalists who are regularly involved in reporting on workplace sexual harassment issues and have indeed won prizes for their coverage, both not recognising that the behaviours that are evidenced by LaBeouf amount to the behaviour of a narcissist. It just shows the extent to which narcissism and the behaviour of narcissists remains relatively unseen by so many, and if they did have insight into that information, it may well have afforded a different response, a sooner escape, and certainly assisted with regard to Ms. Barnett's recovery. She also, now having launched a lawsuit against LaBeouf, needs to understand what will happen with regard to that, as it amounts to a significant assertion of control over him, which his narcissism will have to reject in some form. Whether she realises that this will be the case, or, more likely, as an uninformed victim, believe that LaBeouf will somehow fold as a consequence of seeing the evidence against him, she may well be in for a rude awakening. It is important to note that the idea of narcissism and the narcissist was once again missing from this high-profile situation. The actual judgment makes interesting reading and is something that I have analysed further. And if you would be interested in hearing the analysis of the actual claim that has been filed in the Superior Court of the State of California, County of Los Angeles, which is a complaint for sexual battery, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress and gross negligence, utilise the link in the video description to obtain this very useful information and analysis of a dynamic between a very pitiful narcissist and the relevant victim. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.